Captain Arya Storm walked into her commanding officer's briefing room carrying a cup of coffee that was probably stronger than military-grade fuel, and a smile that could have powered a small space station. General Connor Blake was hunched over his desk, surrounded by holographic displays showing what looked like a planet designed by committee. If that committee consisted entirely of sadists with advanced degrees in creative torture. The red swirling storms on the display cast an ominous glow across his weathered face, making him look like he was already attending his own funeral. "You know, Connor," Arya said, settling into the chair across from him with the casual grace of someone who had never met a regulation she couldn't creatively interpret. "Most people start their Tuesday mornings with pleasant small talk about weather and weekend plans. The human delegation grows. Persistent," he hissed, his reptilian voice carrying that special brand of condescension that only comes with 200 years of diplomatic immunity. "They continue to request permission for expeditions to the Outer Rim territories." Counselor Dexmaria clicked her mandibles in what passed for amusement among her species. The Catherian's compound eyes glittered with something that might have been humor, if humor could be weaponized and used to cut through steel. Persistent. How charmingly human of them. Oh, if only they knew just how charmingly human things were about to get. The holographic display in the center of the chamber flickered to life, showing a planet that looked like someone had taken a perfectly good world and fed it through a blender made of nightmares and poor life choices. Kelthera Prime hung in the artificial starlight, its surface a writhing mass of crimson storms and toxic clouds that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. "Kelthera Prime," Krelnoth announced, as if the name itself might summon demons, which, considering what lived on that rock, wasn't entirely inaccurate. "The humans have specifically requested authorization to conduct reconnaissance on this world." A collective shudder ran through the assembled delegates, not because they were cold. The chamber was kept at a comfortable temperature for approximately 15 different species, but because Kelthera Prime had a reputation that preceded it like a funeral dirge played on bagpipes made of screaming. "In the past 2,000 cycles," Dexmaria continued, her voice taking on the reverent tone usually reserved for eulogies and tax audits, "we have lost 18 separate expeditions to that planet. 18. Not one survivor, not one distress beacon, not even a single piece to bury." The dramatic pause was so thick you could have cut it with a plasma torch and served it at dinner parties. These beings did love their theatrics. "The atmospheric composition alone would dissolve most organic matter within hours," added another delegate, a Vorthan, whose name sounded like someone gargling gravel in a cement mixer. "The indigenous predator species have been classified as Class Omega threats. The electromagnetic storms render all technology useless within minutes of atmospheric entry." And yet, Krelnoth's voice dropped to what he probably thought was an ominous whisper. "The humans wish to send a single operative." Ah, now we're getting to the good part. Because at that very moment, roughly 18 billion kilometers away, Captain Arya Storm was sitting in General Connor Blake's office, her boots propped up on his desk with the kind of casual disrespect that would have given the Galactic Council's Protocol Department a collective aneurysm. "You know they're going to say no," Blake said, not looking up from the mission brief he was pretending to read for the 5th time. The general was a man who had survived 3 interstellar wars, 2 diplomatic incidents that technically never happened, and 1 very awkward dinner party with the Andromedan trade delegation. He had exactly 0 patience left for suicide missions disguised as reconnaissance. They always say no, Arya replied, examining her fingernails with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for disarming nuclear devices. That's what makes it interesting. Blake finally looked up, and his expression was the visual equivalent of a migraine having a migraine. Arya, this isn't interesting. This is stupidity, with a military commission and a death wish. Connor, she said, and her voice carried that particular tone that had preceded some of the most spectacularly impossible victories in human military history. When has that ever stopped me? The general stared at her for a long moment. In that silence, you could almost hear the universe holding its breath, waiting to see what flavor of chaos was about to unfold. Arya Storm was not what you'd call conventionally attractive, unless your definition of conventional included scars that told stories, eyes that had seen too much and found it amusing anyway, and the kind of smile that made smart people very nervous. She was 34 standard years old, had a service record that was equal parts commendations and classified redactions, and possessed the kind of stubborn determination that had once led her to arm wrestle a Corellian battle chief just to prove a point about human tenacity. She won, by the way. The Corellians still won't talk about it. The planet has a 99.6% fatality rate, Blake said, as if stating statistics might somehow penetrate the fortress of willful optimism that Arya called a brain. So, I've got a 0.4% chance of survival, she replied, swinging her feet down and leaning forward with the kind of predatory interest that usually meant someone was about to have a very bad day. I like those odds. No, Arya. Those are the odds of anyone surviving. The odds of you specifically surviving are… Blake paused, did some quick mental calculations involving stubbornness, luck, and what the psychology department charitably called adaptive insanity. Actually, I don't want to know. Back in the council chambers, the debate was reaching the kind of fever pitch usually reserved for arguments about whose turn it is to take out the galactic trash. Various delegates were standing, clicking, chittering, and making the sorts of noises that suggested strong opinions and very little actual solutions. The humans cannot be allowed to attempt this, declared a Felvarian whose voice sounded like wind chimes having an argument with a synthesizer. When they fail, and they will fail, it will reflect poorly on the Council's judgment. When they fail, Krelnoth corrected with the smug certainty of someone who had never met a human having a particularly determined day, we will have one less persistent species to deal with. Oh, sweet summer reptile, if only you knew. The vote, when it came, was swift and decisive. Unanimous rejection. The motion to deny the human request for expedition authorization passed with the kind of overwhelming support usually reserved for motherhood, apple pie, and not getting eaten by cosmic horrors. The message was transmitted to Earth Command within the hour. Standard diplomatic language, flowery rejections, the usual bureaucratic tap dance around the phrase, "Absolutely not in a million years, you insane bipedal mammals." Blake received the transmission 20 minutes later. He read it twice, sighed deeply, and looked across his desk at Arya, who was now juggling 3 plasma grenades with the casual expertise of someone for whom occupational hazard was more of a lifestyle choice than a workplace concern. "They said no," he announced. "Of course they did." Arya caught all 3 grenades and set them down with gentle precision. "Connor, my dear, sweet, perpetually worried commanding officer, when have I ever needed permission to do something stupidly dangerous?" The general's expression shifted through several stages of grief in rapid succession. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally a kind of weary acceptance that came from knowing Arya Storm for 6 years, and understanding that some forces of nature simply cannot be reasoned with. "You're going anyway, aren't you?" "I'm taking some personal leave," Arya said, standing and straightening her uniform with the kind of casual precision that suggested she'd already made her decision about 3 conversations ago. "Going to visit some relatives. Very distant relatives, on a planet that technically doesn't exist in any official capacity." Blake closed his eyes and counted to 10. Then 20. Then he gave up and reached for the bottle of Terran whiskey he kept in his desk drawer for occasions exactly like this. "How long?" he asked. 2 weeks, Arya replied. 3 at the outside. "And if you're not back?" Her smile was the kind of sharp, bright thing that could cut glass, and probably would if given the opportunity. "Then you get to write a very interesting incident report." 36 hours later, Arya was strapping herself into the pilot's seat of a modified reconnaissance ship that definitely wasn't stolen from the impound yard, and certainly hadn't been equipped with experimental shielding, that absolutely wasn't based on technology acquired from a crashed Andromedan freighter. The ship's AI, which she'd named Murphy because it seemed appropriate, chimed in with its perpetually cheerful voice. "Destination locked in, Captain Storm. Kyelthara Prime. Estimated travel time: 6 days, 12 hours, 14 minutes. Estimated survival probability upon arrival. Would you like me to round up to the nearest whole number?" "Murphy," Arya said, running through her pre-flight checklist with the kind of methodical precision that came from years of doing impossible things and living to complain about them afterward. "Has anyone ever told you that you have a terrible bedside manner for an AI?" "Frequently, Captain. However, I find that statistical honesty tends to improve mission preparedness by encouraging proper contingency planning." "Contingency planning," Arya muttered, initiating the launch sequence. "Right. Plan A, don't die. Plan B, if Plan A fails, die spectacularly enough that they write songs about it." The ship lifted off from the hidden launch facility with the kind of smooth grace that suggested very expensive modifications and possibly a few violations of several interstellar treaties. Within minutes, they were clear of Earth's atmosphere and accelerating toward the outer rim at speeds that would have made the Galactic Council's safety inspectors weep openly. As the stars stretched into lines and the universe compressed itself into the familiar tunnel of faster-than-light travel, Arya settled back in her pilot's seat and smiled the kind of smile that usually preceded legendary acts of stupidity, courage, or some combination of the two. "Murphy," she said, "play me something appropriately dramatic. We're about to make history. Shall I cue up funeral dirges, Captain, or something more optimistic?" "Something in between," Arya replied, watching the swirling cosmos race past her view screen. "Something that says, 'Hold my beer and watch this.'" And somewhere in the cold depths of space, Kyelthara Prime waited with the patient hunger of a predator that had never encountered prey quite like Captain Arya Storm. This was going to be interesting. The first thing Arya noticed about Kyelthara Prime, aside from the fact that her ship was currently plummeting toward its surface like a meteor with commitment issues, was that the planet had a serious attitude problem. Her reconnaissance vessel, which had been performing admirably right up until the moment they hit the planet's electromagnetic field, was now spinning through the atmosphere with all the grace and dignity of a drunk penguin attempting ballet. The control panel lit up like a carnival of bad news. "Then you get to write a very interesting incident report." 36 hours later, Arya was strapping herself into the pilot's seat of a modified reconnaissance ship that definitely wasn't stolen from the impound yard and certainly hadn't been equipped with experimental shielding that absolutely wasn't based on technology acquired from a crashed Andromedan freighter. The ship's AI, which she'd named Murphy because it seemed appropriate, chimed in with its perpetually cheerful voice. "Destination locked in, Captain Storm. Kyotera Prime. Estimated travel time: 6 days, 12 hours, 14 minutes. Estimated survival probability upon arrival. Would you like me to round up to the nearest whole number?" "Murphy," Arya said, running through her pre-flight checklist with the kind of methodical precision that came from years of doing impossible things and living to complain about them afterward. "Has anyone ever told you that you have a terrible bedside manner for an AI?" "Frequently, Captain. However, I find that statistical honesty tends to improve mission preparedness by encouraging proper contingency planning." "Contingency planning," Arya muttered, initiating the launch sequence. "Right. Plan A, don't die. Plan B, if Plan A fails, die spectacularly enough that they write songs about it." The ship lifted off from the hidden launch facility with the kind of smooth grace that suggested very expensive modifications and possibly a few violations of several interstellar treaties. Within minutes, they were clear of Earth's atmosphere and accelerating toward the outer rim at speeds that would have made the Galactic Council's safety inspectors weep openly. As the stars stretched into lines and the universe compressed itself into the familiar tunnel of faster-than-light travel, Arya settled back in her pilot's seat and smiled the kind of smile that usually preceded legendary acts of stupidity, courage, or some combination of the two. "Murphy," she said, "play me something appropriately dramatic. We're about to make history. Shall I cue up funeral dirges, Captain, or something more optimistic?" "Something in between," Arya replied, watching the swirling cosmos race past her view screen. "Something that says, 'Hold my beer and watch this.'" And somewhere in the cold depths of space, Kyotera Prime waited with the patient hunger of a predator that had never encountered prey quite like Captain Arya Storm. This was going to be interesting. The first thing Arya noticed about Kyotera Prime, aside from the fact that her ship was currently plummeting toward its surface like a meteor with commitment issues, was that the planet had a serious attitude problem. Her reconnaissance vessel, which had been performing admirably right up until the moment they hit the planet's electromagnetic field, was now spinning through the atmosphere with all the grace and dignity of a drunk penguin attempting ballet. The control panel lit up like a carnival of bad news. "Murphy, I like that in an AI." Arya made her way to the emergency equipment locker, stepping carefully around sparking cables and debris. The atmospheric readings on her portable scanner made for interesting reading. Assuming your definition of interesting included potentially lethal in 12 different ways. The air outside was breathable, technically speaking, though it came with a delightful cocktail of trace toxins that would probably make her glow in the dark within a few days. The atmospheric pressure was manageable. The temperature was merely uncomfortable rather than immediately fatal. And the humidity levels suggested that the planet's weather patterns had been designed by someone with a particularly sadistic sense of humor. "Well, Murphy, it looks like we're going to be here for a while. Start recording a mission log, would you?" Day 1. Arrived on schedule. Landing could have been more elegant. Local real estate market appears to be aggressive. The first time Arya stepped outside her crashed ship, the planet tried to kill her. This wasn't particularly surprising. According to the Galactic Council's files, Kyotera Prime had been trying to kill visitors with remarkable consistency for the past 2 millennia. What was surprising was the sheer creativity involved in the attempt. The rain that began falling approximately 6 minutes after she emerged from the wreckage wasn't just rain, it was rain with ambition and a chemistry degree. The droplets hissed when they hit her environmental suit, leaving small but noticeable burn marks on the reinforced fabric. "Acid rain," Arya muttered, checking her suit's integrity readings. "Because, of course, it's acid rain." But that was just the opening act. The main performance began when she noticed that the twisted trees around her landing site were moving. Not swaying in the wind, there wasn't any wind. Moving. Deliberately. With what appeared to be purpose and possibly malicious intent. The first one that tried to grab her was roughly the size of a mature oak tree. If oak trees came equipped with thorns, the length of sword blades and roots, that could apparently relocate themselves on demand. It reached for her with branches that moved like grasping fingers, and Arya had approximately half a second to decide between diplomatic relations and tactical retreat. She chose tactical retreat, but only after introducing the tree to her plasma cutter. The tree expressed its disapproval by bleeding something that looked like molten copper and smelled like a chemistry lab having a very bad day. "Carnivorous flora," she noted for Murphy's benefit, dodging another grasping branch. "Aggressive, fast-moving, and apparently flammable." Filing under things the Council's briefings forgot to mention. The next 12 hours were what Arya would later describe in her official report, assuming she lived long enough to write one, as educational. She learned, for instance, that the planet's soil contained microscopic organisms that found human sweat absolutely delicious. She discovered that the local insect life came in two varieties, poisonous and more poisonous. And she found out that the electromagnetic storms weren't just interfering with her equipment. They were apparently dinner bells for something large, hungry, and possessed of far too many teeth. She first became aware of the apex stalkers on her second day, when she woke up to find enormous claw marks carved into the trees around her improvised shelter. The gouges were fresh, deep enough to put her entire fist into, and arranged in a pattern that suggested intelligence rather than random scratching. "Murphy," she said, studying the marks with the kind of professional interest usually reserved for particularly challenging crossword puzzles, "what do the xenobiology files say about the indigenous predator species?" "Very little, Captain. Most previous expeditions failed to survive long enough to file comprehensive reports. However, the fragments we do have suggest a species of large pack-hunting predators with enhanced intelligence and territorial behavior. Common designation: apex stalkers. Size estimates: approximately 4 meters in length, 2 meters in height, with enhanced musculature and what appear to be retractable claws. Think of a cross between a saber-toothed tiger and a particularly motivated nightmare." Arya nodded thoughtfully. "And the pack behavior?" "Alpha-dominated hierarchy, highly strategic. They've been known to coordinate complex hunting patterns and demonstrate problem-solving abilities that rival most sentient species." "Wonderful! So I'm dealing with giant intelligent murder cats with opposable thumbs and anger management issues." It was during her exploration of what appeared to be the remains of a previous expedition's campsite that Arya began to suspect something was fundamentally wrong with the official story about Kelthara Prime. The equipment she found was too advanced, too recent. The Galactic Council claimed that no one had attempted a landing on the planet in over 50 standard years, but the power cells she discovered were maybe 2 years old. Tops. More importantly, the expedition logs, what fragments she could recover from the damaged databanks, painted a picture that didn't match the Death World narrative at all. These weren't the desperate final recordings of doomed explorers. They were detailed scientific observations, careful mapping notations, and geological surveys. "Murphy, Run a spectral analysis on these mineral samples. Analyzing, Captain, these readings are quite unusual. Define unusual. Well, for starters, the mineral composition suggests the presence of rare earth elements in concentrations that would make this planet strategically valuable. Very strategically valuable. We're talking about enough resources to shift the balance of power in 3 different sectors. Arya sat back on her heels, staring at the EKIE data readouts with the kind of expression that usually preceded very loud explosions and strongly worded diplomatic protests. So, let me get this straight. The Galactic Council has been telling everyone that this planet is uninhabitable and deadly, while simultaneously conducting secret mining surveys and resource assessments, Murphy finished. It would appear that the Death World designation serves as rather effective. What's the human term? Do not disturb signage. Those magnificent, scheming, lying. Arya's commentary on the Council's ancestry and personal hygiene habits was interrupted by a sound that made her blood freeze in her veins. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but with an organic quality that suggested lungs and vocal cords rather than meteorological phenomena. The sound was coming from multiple directions, which meant either she was surrounded by several very large, very unhappy creatures, or one extremely large creature with multiple heads. Given her luck so far, she was betting on the former. Arya moved with the kind of careful, deliberate precision that comes from years of military training and a healthy respect for things that could bite her head off. Her plasma rifle was in her hands and charged before the echoes of that first growl had faded, and she'd already identified 3 potential escape routes and 2 defensive positions. The first apex stalker that emerged from the twisted forest was magnificent and terrifying, but mostly terrifying. Murphy's physical description hadn't done justice to the reality. The creature was 4 meters of perfectly evolved killing machine, with midnight black fur that seemed to absorb light and muscles that moved like liquid steel beneath its hide. Its eyes were the color of molten gold, and they fixed on Arya with the kind of intelligent assessment that suggested it was considering the best approach to dismantling her into component parts. "Hello, beautiful," Arya whispered, keeping her weapon trained on center mass, while her mind raced through tactical options. "I don't suppose you're interested in discussing this like civilized beings." The stalker's response was to bare teeth that belonged in a weapons manufacturer's catalog and emit a sound that was part roar, part challenge, and entirely terrifying. "I'll take that as a no," Arya muttered, and then the real dance began. The thing about being hunted by apex predators with PhDs in creative murder is that it really puts your life choices into perspective. Arya had been playing cat and mouse with the stalker pack for 3 days, except she was definitely the mouse in this scenario, and the cats had apparently been taking advanced courses in psychological warfare. They weren't just hunting her. They were studying her, learning her patterns, testing her responses like she was some kind of particularly interesting laboratory specimen. "Murphy," she whispered into her comm unit, while crouched behind a formation of crystalline rocks that jutted from the ground like frozen lightning. "Remind me why I thought this was a good idea." "You didn't think it was a good idea, Captain. You thought it was necessary. There's a significant difference between the 2 concepts." A low growl echoed from somewhere to her left, answered by another from her right. The pack was coordinating, communicating in ways that suggested a level of intelligence that made Arya distinctly uncomfortable. These weren't mindless predators driven by hunger. They were tactical thinkers with claws. "How many do you estimate?" she asked, checking her plasma rifle's charge for the dozenth time that hour. Based on vocalization patterns and movement tracking, I would estimate between 6 and 8 individuals. However, Captain, I should point out that they've had multiple opportunities to attack directly, yet they continue to maintain distance and observe. That had been bothering Arya, too. In her considerable experience with things that wanted to kill her, most of them tended to get straight to the point. This felt different. This felt like, "They're testing me," she realized, the pieces clicking together with the satisfying precision of a well-maintained weapon. "They're not hunting me for food. They're evaluating me." For what purpose? Before Arya could answer, the forest around her exploded into motion. The attack came from 5 directions simultaneously. A coordinated assault that would have made military strategists weep with professional admiration. But these weren't random charges. Each stalker moved with surgical precision, cutting off escape routes, herding her toward a predetermined position with the kind of tactical awareness that belonged in war colleges, not wildlife documentaries. Arya rolled left as claws the size of kitchen knives carved grooves in the rock where her head had been a microsecond earlier. Her plasma rifle spat coherent energy, and one of the stalkers leaped backward with a roar that sounded distinctly annoyed rather than injured. "Warning shots," she muttered, firing another burst that deliberately missed its target by centimeters. "They're giving me warning shots." The largest of the pack, a specimen that made the others look like house cats, stepped into the clearing with the kind of casual authority that suggested it was used to being obeyed. This had to be the Alpha. Its golden eyes fixed on Arya with an intelligence that was deeply unsettling, and when it spoke, actually spoke, in a series of guttural sounds that carried unmistakable meaning, she nearly dropped her weapon. "Murphy, are you getting this?" "Recording everything, Captain. Preliminary analysis suggests a complex communication system with grammatical structure and syntax." The Alpha made another series of sounds, its head tilted in what might have been curiosity. When Arya didn't respond, it repeated the sequence, more slowly this time, as if it were teaching a particularly slow student. "It's trying to communicate," Arya breathed. "It's actually trying to talk to me." She lowered her weapon, not completely, because she wasn't suicidal, just optimistic, and attempted what she hoped was a non-threatening gesture. The Alpha's ears perked forward, and it made a different sound, shorter, with an unmistakable questioning inflection. "I don't speak. Whatever this is," Arya said aloud, knowing the Alpha probably couldn't understand her words, but hoping her tone might convey something useful. "But I'm listening." What followed was the most surreal conversation of Arya's life, which was saying something considering she'd once spent an entire evening discussing agricultural subsidies with a sentient plant from the Vega system. The Alpha would make a series of sounds, wait for her response, then try a different approach when she clearly didn't understand. It actually gestured, with deliberate movements that suggested abstract thinking toward the crashed ship, toward the sky, toward the hidden ruins that Arya hadn't even known were there until the Alpha pointed them out. "It knows about the ruins," she told Murphy. "It's been watching the other expeditions, too." "Captain, I'm detecting artificial structures approximately 2 kilometers northeast of your position. The energy signatures are unusual." The Alpha made another sound, this one with an unmistakable note of urgency, and began moving toward the northeast. It paused after a few steps, looked back at Arya, and made what could only be described as an impatient gesture. "I think," Arya said slowly, "I'm being invited on a field trip." The ruins were magnificent in the way that really ancient things sometimes are. Not beautiful, exactly, but impressive in their sheer defiance of time and weather. Massive stone blocks fitted together with precision that suggested either incredible engineering skill or technology that made current construction methods look like children playing with toy blocks. But it wasn't the architecture that made Arya's breath catch in her throat. It was what the architecture was protecting. "Murphy, are you seeing this?" "I am, Captain, and I'm running structural analyses that suggest these aren't ruins at all. They're active." The complex stretched underground for what appeared to be several square kilometers, a network of chambers and corridors that hummed with barely perceptible energy. The walls were covered with symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, and the air itself felt thick with potential, like the moment before lightning strikes. The Alpha led her deeper into the complex, moving with the confidence of familiarity. Other stalkers materialized from the shadows as they walked, not threatening but watchful, like guards accompanying honored guests through sacred territory. "They're protecting this place," Arya realized. "The stalkers aren't just predators, they're guardians." In the deepest chamber, surrounded by crystalline formations that pulsed with soft, rhythmic light, Arya found what the Galactic Council had really been looking for. The technology was unlike anything in current databases, not just advanced, but fundamentally different, as if it had been designed by minds that thought in dimensions humans could barely comprehend. Power sources that drew energy from quantum fluctuations, communication arrays that could reach across galactic distances instantly, manufacturing systems that could reshape matter at the molecular level. "This is why they've been keeping people away," Arya breathed, running her scanner over instruments that registered energy readings beyond the device's ability to measure. "This isn't about mining rights or territorial claims. This is about technology that could remake the galaxy." The Alpha watched her examination with patient attention, occasionally making soft sounds that might have been commentary or questions. When she reached for one of the crystalline artifacts, it made a sharp noise that was clearly a warning. "Not supposed to touch. Got it," Arya said, pulling her hand back. "But you brought me here for a reason. You wanted me to see this." The Alpha's response was a complex series of sounds, accompanied by gestures toward the entrance, toward the sky, and toward Arya herself. The meaning was unclear, but the urgency was unmistakable. "Captain," Murphy's voice crackled through her comm with unusual static, "I'm detecting multiple ships entering the system. Configuration matches Galactic Council patrol vessels." Arya's blood went cold. "How many?" 12 ships, heavy assault configuration. Estimated arrival at planetary surface, 18 hours. The Alpha had gone perfectly still, its golden eyes fixed on Arya with an intensity that was almost physical. When it spoke again, its voice carried a note she recognized from her own military experience, the sound of a commander issuing orders before battle. The other stalkers began moving with sudden purpose, disappearing into the tunnels with the fluid efficiency of a well-trained unit mobilizing for war. The Alpha remained, watching Arya with what she was beginning to understand was a test. Not a test of her combat skills or her survival instincts, a test of her choice. "They know about the Council ships," Arya said slowly. "They've been monitoring space traffic. They know what's coming." The Alpha made a sound that was unmistakably confirmation, then gestured again, toward the ruins, toward Arya, toward the surface. "You're asking me to choose sides," she realized, "between my own species and this." The Alpha's response was patient silence, the kind of quiet that demands an answer. Arya looked around the chamber. at technology that could revolutionize civilization or destroy it, at crystalline formations that hummed with power beyond imagination, at an ancient complex that had been protected by intelligent predators for longer than human civilization had existed. Then she looked at the Alpha, at golden eyes that held intelligence, honor, and a kind of weary determination that she recognized from her own mirror. "Murphy," she said quietly, "how long would it take to reach the surface and signal the Council ships?" "Approximately 4 hours, Captain." "And how long to rig the ship's reactor to create a distraction that might buy the stalkers time to relocate whatever they're protecting here?" "Captain, that would be—" Murphy paused, processing implications. "That would be treason." "No, Murphy. That would be the right thing to do." The Alpha stepped closer, close enough that Arya could see the scars on its muzzle, the old wounds that spoke of battles fought and won. When it lowered its great head in what was unmistakably a gesture of respect, she knew she'd made the right choice. "All right, beautiful," she said, reaching out to touch the Alpha's forehead with careful fingers. "Let's give the Council something to really worry about." The Alpha's purr was like distant thunder, and when it pulled back, its eyes held something that might have been approval. Or perhaps amusement. Either way, Arya thought, as she began planning the most spectacular act of insubordination in military history, this was going to be interesting. 3 weeks later, Captain Arya Storm walked into the Galactic Council chambers carrying the Alpha's skull and wearing a grin that could have cut through reinforced steel. The assembled delegates, the same pompous collection of beings who had so confidently declared Kelthara Prime unsurvivable, fell silent with the kind of stunned quiet usually reserved for natural disasters and tax audits. Ambassador Krelnoth's forked tongue flicked out once, twice, then retreated as if it had tasted something fundamentally wrong with the universe. "Counselor Dex Maria." "Ambassador Krelnoth," Arya said pleasantly, setting the massive skull on the central podium with a hollow thunk that echoed through the chamber like a funeral bell. "I believe you said something about nobody surviving that planet?" The skull was magnificent. 2 meters of bone and sinew that spoke of intelligence, strength, and a death that had been both honorable and necessary. The Alpha's golden eyes were gone, but the bone structure around the eye sockets suggested a creature that had seen far more than most beings ever would. General Connor Blake stood in the gallery, his expression cycling through relief, admiration, and the kind of resigned terror that came from knowing Arya Storm for 6 years. He'd been officially reprimanding her for unauthorized leave when she'd walked in. Unofficially, he'd been preparing her posthumous commendation. "Captain Storm," Krelnoth managed, his voice carrying the particular strain that comes from having one's fundamental worldview kicked down the stairs and set on fire. "You were reported missing, presumed deceased." "Presumed incorrectly," Arya replied, producing a data pad from her uniform with casual precision. "I have a full mission report, complete with atmospheric readings, geological surveys, biological assessments, and some very interesting findings about previous expeditions to Kelthara Prime." Counselor Dex Maria's compound eyes glittered with something that might have been panic masquerading as curiosity. "Previous expeditions?" "Oh, yes," Arya said, her voice taking on the kind of cheerful tone that usually preceded very expensive explosions. "Turns out the planet has been quite busy over the past few years. Mining surveys, resource assessments, preliminary terraforming studies. Fascinating reading, really." The silence that followed was so complete, you could have heard a pin drop in a neighboring solar system. "You see," Arya continued, settling into what had clearly become an interrogation rather than a debriefing. The apex stalkers, those magnificent creatures you claimed were mindless predators, they've been keeping very detailed records. They're quite literate, actually. Shame about the language barrier. She gestured to the skull with genuine respect. This particular alpha lived for over 200 years, witnessed every single expedition the Council sent to his world, watched your people strip mine sacred sites and steal artifacts from ruins that predate most of your civilizations. General Blake stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes sharp with understanding. Captain, what exactly did you find on Kael'thara Prime? Technology, General. Ancient, powerful, and completely revolutionary. The kind of discoveries that could shift the balance of power across the galaxy. Arya's smile turned predatory. The kind of discoveries that certain parties might want to keep secret while they acquired exclusive access. Ambassador Krell Noth's scales had gone several shades paler. Captain Storm, you were sent on an unauthorized reconnaissance mission. Your findings are unofficial. Oh, but that's where you're wrong, Arya said, producing another device from her uniform. You see, the Stalkers have been broadcasting everything. Every mining operation, every theft, every violation of their territory. They've been sending detailed reports to anyone willing to listen. The device in her hand flickered to life, projecting a complex star map dotted with communication signatures. Hundreds of them. Thousands. It turns out that mindless predators are excellent at quantum communication networks. Who knew? Arya's grin widened. They've been telling the entire galaxy about your little resource grab. The Andromedans are particularly interested. Something about interstellar law and unauthorized territorial exploitation. Counselor Dex Maria's mandibles clicked rapidly, the Catherian equivalent of nervous laughter. This is clearly a misunderstanding. Perhaps we can discuss terms. Terms? Arya laughed, and the sound carried genuine amusement. The Stalkers don't want terms. They want acknowledgement. Recognition as a sentient species with territorial rights, official protection for their world and the technology they've been guarding for millennia. She picked up the Alpha's skull with gentle hands, cradling it like a sacred artifact. This is from their greatest leader, freely given as a symbol of respect between equals. He died protecting his people's heritage from your mining operations. He died because you killed him, Krell Noth said, his voice sharp with accusation. No, Arya replied quietly, and for the first time since entering the chamber, her expression grew serious. He died because your people's greed forced him into a position where sacrifice was the only option left. I just helped him make it count. The truth was more complex than that. A battle that had lasted 3 days, fought not for conquest, but for understanding. The Alpha had tested her, challenged her, and ultimately chosen to pass on his responsibility to someone who would protect what mattered. His death had been his choice, his final gift to ensure his people's survival. The skull comes with a message, Arya continued, setting the artifact back on the podium. The Stalkers are offering the Council a choice, official recognition and protected status for Kael'thara Prime, with shared research agreements for the ancient technology, or ... She let the word hang in the air like a sword over their heads. Or, Dex Maria asked, or they broadcast the full details of your illegal operations to every major power in the galaxy. Turns out, ancient quantum communication networks have excellent reach. The Vegan Trade Consortium is already asking pointed questions about resource rights violations. General Blake stepped forward, and his expression carried the kind of professional admiration usually reserved for particularly elegant military maneuvers. "Captain Storm, what exactly are you recommending?" Arya's smile returned, bright and sharp and absolutely merciless. "I'm recommending that the Council recognize reality, General. Humans don't just survive impossible situations. We make friends with them. We adapt, we learn, and we come back with stories that make the universe a more interesting place." She gestured to the skull, to the data pad, to the communication device still projecting its constellation of evidence. "The Stalkers asked me to deliver a simple message. They're willing to work with the galaxy's civilizations, but they're also perfectly capable of protecting themselves." "And you?" Krelnoth asked. "What do you gain from this advocacy?" "Me?" Arya laughed, and the sound carried pure, uncomplicated joy. "I get to go down in history as the human who made first contact with a species that could revolutionize galactic civilization. I get to be the one who proved that sometimes the best way to survive the impossible is to make it your friend." She picked up her datapad and turned toward the exit, pausing only to look back at the assembled delegates with one final, devastating smile. "Oh, and I get to write the mission report that explains how humanity just became the Stalkers' official galactic representatives. I'm thinking the title should be, 'They Said No One Survives That Planet.' I came back with a new ally and a really good story." As the chamber erupted into chaos behind her, Arya Storm walked out with the kind of satisfied swagger that belonged to someone who had just redefined the possible. Behind her, the delegates scrambled to salvage what remained of their carefully constructed lies. Emergency sessions would be called, diplomatic cables would fly across the galaxy, and somewhere in the depths of bureaucratic panic, the Galactic Council would begin the humbling process of acknowledging they'd been outsmarted by both humans and mindless predators. But that was their problem now. Arya had a report to file, a commendation to probably not receive, and a very interesting conversation to have with the Stalker delegation that was already en route to establish their first embassy. The Alpha's successor had proven remarkably adept at interstellar politics, which probably shouldn't have been surprising considering they'd been watching galactic civilization stumble around for centuries. The universe, she reflected as she headed for the nearest bar to celebrate properly, was about to become a much more honest place, and significantly more dangerous for anyone foolish enough to underestimate the neighbors.